Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our webinar today. We're going to take a look at the soil moisture monitoring dashboard that Agriculture Victoria host online, and we have some local sites in the Greta catchment that we're going to be taking a closer look at today. So my name was Sally Day. I'm the project officer for the Greta Valley Landcare Group, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. If we can keep our videos turned off, and if you have a question through the webinar, if you can post that in the chat function for me, we will get a chance to have a good talk, a bit of a Q&A session at the end. So I'd love to welcome our speaker for the day, Dale Boyd from AgVic. Thanks for coming on board, Dale. Dale's a seasonal risk agronomist with AgVic, and he's been working in the soil moisture probe space around grains research for quite a long time. And I think this dashboard started back in 2018, and Dale will tell us more, but it's recently undergone a bit of a facelift and the front end is looking terrific. And Dale's going to talk us through how we can use that to help manage pastures and risk on our property. So I'll hand over to you, Dale, and turn my video off, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Sally, and very happy to join today and provide my story of the journey I've gone with the use of soil moisture probes and their use to record soil moisture at depths and at depths that haven't been monitored before. So it's really provided some great insights to predominantly grain farmers, but we've certainly moved into the space of monitoring pasture sites now. And I think just this illustration here is a great example. So it's the probe, it's got the measurement detecting the amount of water in that profile, and effectively you could turn that around to say, you know, how much water is in the tank. As I said, I work in the grains team, and these moisture probes that we commissioned in 2011 have now accumulated 10 years of data. So it's pretty fascinating when you can look back and see what's happened in terms of soil moisture changes at a number of locations across the state. And I'm a seasonal risk agronomist, so it's that seasonal variability that we're still farmers have always had to manage that. But when we look at this extended data set going back to 2011, and this is a northeast monitoring point over near Tungamar, the way to interpret the data is that anything in this blue zone is getting near or getting to a field capacity point, so saturation. Anything in the red is getting to the level where the crops or the plants finding it physically hard to extract any more water out of that profile. And so anything in this green zone is plant available water. Now, being a cropping paddock, there's obviously different crops grown each year annually. And the blue bars indicate the rainfall levels for a 24-hour period. So when we look back, there's obviously been some, quite prosperous years and some opportunities to grow good crops, but there's been some hiccups along the way. So 2013, 2015 has certainly been challenging years where they've, struggled to get near 50% of the profile to be filled. And 2018 was certainly a challenge as well, because really a fairly dry year, but was sort of offset by significant rain at the end of 2017 and also more rain at the end of 2018. But outside that annual cropping cycle for grain production. But if you've got moisture that can be banked, it's certainly something that can be utilised in the spring period. So this is where we're getting to the point where grain farmers have had really good use of the technology, and to the point where there's been great adoption, particularly in the low to medium rainfall zones. And when we look at what the farmers are using it, particularly grain farmers, I've just got some clips out of some newspapers, and these farmers have obviously got a measurement device in their paddocks because they're confident enough to state percentages of moisture. within the media. So this is for a farmer near Elmore, and then this farmer here that we've worked with over near Kerrang, they've got a pretty good idea of what their moisture profile is, and they've even been able to record rainfall and know what the contribution was from that rainfall. So they're really seeing the effect of rain and infiltration. So they're certainly linking all those things together to form that picture of their moisture profile. In terms of where we've come from, so it's just a bit of backgrounding. I've probably been working in the space of soil moisture monitoring for over 20 years, and I've seen great developments occur over that space of time. In those 2002 to 2008, the moisture probes are working quite effectively, but the way of collecting it in the field was pretty cumbersome and pretty time consuming. So for this example here, I had to go and physically tap on that logger, grab the data, and then connect it into the computer, progressing to some solar panels and some logging devices there, monitoring pasture. But we really started to see some advancements progressing through past 2010 with some telemetry devices to connect it up. The issue we had at the time was that the graphing interface was quite cumbersome and not that user friendly. And so when I started commissioning sites in 2010 into 11, I sort of said, well, the data is good, but we really need to make it more visually pleasing for the user so they could actually understand the data better. So this is probably my early comments on the service provider on things, just how to change and make it more presentable. And as Sally mentioned, we've now progressed to the point where the data's been displayed on a service provider as platform. In the last couple of years, I've then converted that into a dashboard to where we've been able to list the sites within the AgVic network and a few others that have been using the same server to store data, and then just being able to have a click on a button on that icon site and you get a pop-up of what the snapshot of the conditions are, which has been quite handy. And now even progressing to the point where each site will present a fuel gauge or a speedometer of the percentage of soil moisture. And we can then display each icon by color coding, which indicates the plant available water at each site. And so spatially, we can start to get a picture of how the season is, how it's progressing through autumn into winter, and then the growth through spring and into early summer and that moisture depletion. And to the point we've still got, this is as it is recorded at the moment, still some sites that have got some quite good moisture percentages above 3/4, and also some pasture sites and some drying of the profiles out to the southwest and the hill country there. So, and we've obviously got some gaps and we're looking to fill in those gaps, but we've also seen that private investment to fill gaps as well. But these monitoring points that we do present certainly provide a reference point to provide some guidance. So by tapping on that icon, you can then progress further into the dashboard with the AgVic dashboard. And what I was really looking to do with this dashboard was display a bit more information about the actual site and indicating what the plant type was, whether it was pasture or whether it's in cropping, who's actually funding the site, because we've got some other sites coming on board now. So we'd like to acknowledge who's providing the funds to provide that data, and the soil descriptor as well, because that's obviously an important factor, is the water holding capacity of that soil, whether it's light, medium or heavy, and that certainly has an influence on the infiltration associated with rain events. Certainly finding good effect by having just some critical instrumentation to display some of the key data collected. So with the moisture probe, we're also collecting soil temperature. So the 10 centimeter sensor, the one closest to the surface that we've got, we'd like to indicate what that 9 AM soil temperature is. We've certainly found where the probes have got 8 sensors, just by indicating the percentage of plant available water going down through that profile can certainly provide an indication of where it's drying, where it's still wet, in this instance there with the Greta Hill pasture paddock. And we've certainly found good effect by utilising the data to convert it into a fuel gauge or a speedometer. The other thing that particularly grain farmers are looking to know is that we've got data collected and relevant for that point in time. What's the projections moving forward? How's the seasonal outlook look? And I work in the seasonal risk team, and I've got a colleague, Dale Gray, who crunches the models to determine what that seasonal outlook is coming up like in terms of probabilities. And that can be certainly well utilised to provide some guidance in terms of some ratings of these 5, drier, neutral, and then moving into that wetter point. What are the possibilities? And indicated by 12 models, we've certainly had this wetter to wetter neutral influence, and greater chances of being highlighted really since about midwinter. And we're also been then the formation of that speedo is on the basis of analysing all 8 sensors at that data point and combining them into that sum point there, which then produces the speedo. So I'll go into more detail with that later, but in terms of just how the moisture probes operate and install, just some images taken, and this is actually from the Greta site. So the moisture probe that we're using is a capacitance type. Here's the internals of it with 8 individual sensors spaced 10 centimeters apart. And the way it's collecting soil moisture data is by sending out a current that moves through the soil medium, only a small reference point, but moving out from that plate and then being collected at the other side of the plate. And it's really determining the capacitance of that soil to hold water, or the resistance. So a wetter soil will have a higher value, and when we plot that over time, so these probes will collect data on the hour every hour, we can certainly then start to observe trend lines right down through the profile, which gives us a good image of what's happening at that monitoring point. It's so important with that install technique to do a small pilot hole, fill it with a slurry solution, and then insert the probe. So there's no physical disturbance of the soil just outside the soil medium that we're actually measuring. And then we're physically digging a trench and directing that probe back to the telemetry unit, which is generally based on a fence line to give it some protection from stock. So guarding is so essential to have that around that device, because there are potentially exposed cables. And then just the recent install technique is that the telemetry unit has got a fair cost associated with it. And the moisture probes at an approximate cost of about $1,000 for an 80 centimeter probe. We're now finding that you can actually connect up 2 moisture probes, get twice as much data if you've got 2 points of reference that are potentially different. So the case here that we're looking to monitor, and we've got some examples at the Greta site as well, but monitoring lucerne, so your perennial nature pasture species, utilising water all year round versus what would be an annual crop. So something that's sown in April, May, and utilising water up until October, November, until harvest time. So two different usages of water. So very interesting to compare where you can, with those points of reference being different and same soil type. So just moving on to the Greta site, we've got 3 points of reference here. So all pretty much similar for soil type. So in terms of the references for the Greta site, we've got the Glen Rowan Road, the sealed road running down here, and then Alice Lane, the dirt road, being the reference there. And so what we've done is actually done that pairing of a site for monitoring 2 points of reference. So to the north, we're monitoring annual pasture, and to the south, it was a probe that was placed in phalaris, so a perennial base pasture system. And then the logger, or the rain gauge, and the collector is all located there. And then about, it's probably not even a kilometre away, we're monitoring some like a slope, a hill pasture. And I guess the beauty of what we're doing here is that we're collecting data from the hill, and that's the image of the site here. And it's actually using a radio frequency transmission to transmit data to this main site there. And then that's where it then gets connected up to a server and then becomes accessible by the internet. Whereas here it's pretty much just a standalone unit of a moisture probe and a battery. Whereas this site here has certainly got the capacity to collect a lot of information and data. And that's the image we've got here of that particular point, which effectively is the gateway. So it's a whole bigger unit. We're certainly collecting rainfall from this site on the hour. And because it's a remote site, I'm based in Echuca. I can't get to all the sites, but I can also quite effectively track what is happening with this annual pasture site with the use of a camera that will take a photo once a day and provides that good perspective of pasture growth. And even, with the start of the season we had with significant rain in January and progressing through with March as well, the germination of those annuals, I could certainly pick that up by the camera. I should note that this logger here has got the capacity to have 12 sensors added to it. So, I mean, it's a pretty basic setup that we've got here at the moment, but we could certainly add temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction quite simply by adding those weather station instrumentation. And in terms of the soil type, it's sort of a silty loam. I continually inspect the soil and track and validate data because the capacitance will give us those soil moisture references, but it's also very good to then validate that data and just track if it's indicating that moisture is down to 30 centimetres. You knock these physical soil cores in, and then you can examine to see where it's wet, where it's dry, and really builds confidence in terms of, okay, that the data is accurate. Let's start plotting it. Let's start understanding it, and let's start then putting in some systems to then make some informed decisions from it, which we're still getting to that point with pastures, but we've certainly progressed past that point with the croppers because, they're certainly managing canopy, managing inputs according to their moisture profile and potential yields. So in terms of data collection at the Greta site, we've just did a tally. We're up to 1,383 days of data in terms of soil moisture. This is plotted from the annual pasture where that image was just taken from. And early on, I guess I was trying to determine the reference of where we've got a fill capacity, which now we can probably determine it's up here above that saturation. In the early days of 18 and 19, we hit a reference point of a lower limit where it become physically hard for the pasture to extract much more moisture from that, and a softer finish in 2020, and the way we're probably going to track in 2021 as well. We're not going to get to those really dry points, but this is the plan available water, and we can certainly see where we can start off the season associated with significant rainfall events that start to impact and start to register at the sensors starting at 10 centimetres. So that's a summed line. That's really, the story of how full the bucket is. We can then progress into the individual sensors, which really put into the perspective of the finite details of rainfall and infiltration. I've gone back to the reference of 2019 just to show how we can start to plot rainfall and the influence it has on the shallower sensors. And these are just stacked as they're found in the soil profile. So 10 centimetres, 20, 30. So as it gradually gets to wet down at depth, we're starting to see influences and getting wetter at 40, 50, and eventually getting to the point where we know that, even at 80 centimetres, it's wet. And also just interpreting these lines when we get a flat line period. So we're getting rainfall, but it's not getting wetter. That just indicates that these soils have reached their field capacity, can't hold anymore. So any more rain that falls upon at this point in time, it starts to move deeper into the profile. So if we had deeper sensors, we would certainly be able to detect that. And then 2019, with limited rain, the plant is exceeding its water use as it's fallen from rainfall. So that's when it starts to mine the deeper moisture levels. And so, we've certainly been able to determine that annual grasses with the germination, growth over winter, root development, it certainly will pick up moisture and use moisture down at a metre and potentially deeper. So we've certainly got some learnings there. And comparing that hill slope on the hill pasture, it really follows similar trends to what we had at that on the flats when you compare the two. So just now interpreting this season and the progressive development of germination of the annuals and the building up of soil moisture. Obviously there was very significant rain at the end of January and the start of February, to the point where we've started off at maybe 25% in the profile, significantly build it up to a full profile, a germination and plant water usage, and probably to the point where progressing through autumn was a fair concern whether it was going to be a false break or not. But fortunately, it seemed like the rain came just in the nick of time. There was probably enough just to keep the emerging annuals alive, progressing into then more productive growth, and then the realization that the annuals were right and building up of the soil profile with significant rain progressing through June, and probably observed that the profile spent a fair bit of the time through that June, July and August and even into September in a very wet state, and particularly the deeper sensors were holding a lot of water. So that's showing the trend lines of this season and those individual sensors. In terms of some lessons learned about the moisture probes and the logging devices and the telemetry devices, so essential to have that guarding to protect any cables from chewing activity from, could be foxes, could be stock. Ants are obviously could be an issue. This is actually the site on that hill pasture where just a small gap, the grommet wasn't quite giving a great seal, and yeah, the ants certainly like to move into higher areas, and they pretty much put moisture into that and wreck that battery and that whole circuit board, which required to be replaced. And the rain gauge that we've got at Greta appears to be pretty reliable, but yeah, it's something that does require some maintenance, and at times the funnel can get blocked up and essentially hold water like a bucket. So just a little bit of maintenance is required on those on a frequency that probably on a monthly basis, I would say. But that rain gauge, that automatic rain gauge, can be so valuable. And particularly when you've got outblocks. Obviously, you've potentially got a rain gauge that can be manually read at your home block. This is an example that was recorded just north of Bendigo, and it just provided a great example when you're collecting data on an hourly basis, and you can reflect on that. The home block on this farm actually only got about 18 mil, but just with that nature of thunderstorms that we've been encountering just recently, and also we encountered this in in February, just a really significant thunderstorm that come across this property. And to be honest, this is one of the heaviest storms I've seen recorded with a tipping rain gauge, but well over 2 inches, and even progressed into 3 inches on the space of 3 hours, which was really a game changer, because 75 mil in that space of time, if you've got soils that can allow that infiltration, banks a fair bit of water, and banks a fair bit of water for this cropping farmer, because anytime you can opportunistically put moisture in the bank, it's something that can be used later on for your annual cropping. And here's just an example from the Greta site, and I'll show you an example of how to tap into that. But the hour by hour reading on the 12th of November, progressing into 13. Yeah, so accumulated up to about 30 odd mil, I believe, for that rain event, but pretty steady rain. So with that, I can progress into going through the dashboard. So I see that Sally's sent out the link on the extensionoz.com.au site. And that will probably allow opportunities to ask questions as well.
That's great, Dale. We've got your dashboard up, so we can see that here. That's excellent.
So here's the example. Here's the dashboard, the Extension Oz platform. Features that I already indicated. You can hover over any site, get a pop-up, and get an indication of the soil moisture, plant available water in the form of that speedo. This here is an overlay of the modelled soil moisture from the Bureau of Meteorology. There's a few options. You can go back into the street view and pick up a better idea of the locations of the moisture probe sites. And you can also determine the anomaly, or that might work for the Bureau of Meteorology, but that's where it's going to give you a rating of the deciles. So at the moment, we've got over 50 sites being presented on this dashboard, and they're a combination of cropping and pasture sites. If you ever wanted to just zoom in and isolate the cropping sites, you can look at those. Or you can look at the grazing sites to put it in perspective. And most of those pasture sites being installed in the last 3 years as a pilot, and certainly have been targeted in the medium to high rainfall zones. That's that. Within the dashboard, we've included some case studies, and at this stage, it's case studies from grain farmers, and certainly encourage you to click on those, and certainly provides good examples of a long historical data set collection, and these guys are really in tune with understanding soil moisture, understanding their seasonal conditions, and applying the right amount of inputs. One, to maximise yields. So Wayne Thomas in the northeast would have been maximising his yield potentials this year, whereas Hugh over there in the Wimmera, there were certainly parts in the Wimmera that never actually filled their profile. It was a fairly challenging season. So he was actually adjusting his inputs according to the season this year. But on better seasons, which had been the last two, he'd certainly put higher amounts of inputs into it. Probably when I click on the Greta icon, the quick pop-up, soil temperature 17 degrees, recent rain yesterday 1 mil and a little bit today. As I said, it's a silty loam. What we need to do is to get its conversion into how many mils that soil can hold. It's still got to be converted and to be calculated. But dragging down the immediate pop-ups, soil temperature, the current moisture sensor by the percentage, and the speedo. This is the summed line. So we're only just starting to progress down from that high full point. Why that's at that full point, I believe, is these deeper sensors are at field capacity and probably well beyond. So they're actually carrying a lot of water, and that the speedo is a total of the total soil moisture. So these are certainly influencing the overall picture, but we're starting to see some depletion of the moisture, particularly at 10, 20 and 30 centimeters, and a little bit of movement at 40. So just with that little bit of dryness in the last couple of weeks. Rainfall, it's presented on a 24-hour basis with a 9 AM tally, and scrolling down, we can get the month by month cumulative totals, how it's currently positioned for year to date. And in terms of getting it to a long-term average, we go back to a reference station at Moyu. Soil temperature being plotted just by running a mouse over that. You can get an indication of soil temperature changes. Obviously, it's been a pretty cool start to December or summer, so we haven't seen any great rises in the soil temperature. And just some images attributed to the site, as I found that's a very handy picture for putting in perspective of not just the locals and Landcare members, but other people that might be looking at this from other parts of the state.
Dale, could I jump in with a question there for you?
Yep.
Just on soil temperature, you've got the probes in at 10 centimetre depths for soil temp. How strongly is that soil temperature influenced by cover? And do we see it, a high link with, as temperatures rise, evaporation increases, and is that linked to cover, or what's the mode of relationship between those three variables?
Yeah. From what I've observed, that soil temperature, probably the main influences are by the ambient temperature and soil moisture.
Yep.
And then probably cover comes in after that. We can certainly see the effect after frosts and the cooling of the soil. That certainly has a pretty dramatic effect, and we can see that progressing through winter. Collect soil temperature at all those 8 sensors, but probably the most relevant one is the one closest to the soil surface. And we're finding that growers are utilising this for summer cropping options and certain soil temperature thresholds that you can get more success with your emergence and germination of those summer plants. So probably just on the borderline with the temperature thresholds at this stage, but it's not actually a rising temperature. So
it's been a pretty cool start, hasn't it?
Yeah, yep. The grain farmers really haven't utilised the soil temperature, but I believe that the grazing farmers will be taking more of a notice of this.
Yep. Thank you.
Another question that you asked me a little while ago was using data for re-veg and tree plantings and watering times. And I've been thinking about that, and the moisture probes would certainly provide an indication of as the profile is drying and maybe getting to the point where you would consider coming in and watering trees if they were planted. And probably what we can observe at the moment is that there's a heck of a lot of water at depth. So, it might feel dryish on that top horizon and moving maybe down to 30 centimetres, but there's still ample soil water that would be supplying those deep-rooted plants and pastures and trees. But as it dries out, that would certainly provide an indicator that you could consider going out and watering trees to keep that tree growth progressing through summer and particularly with newly sown trees, just to have them in that ideal environment to progress through that first and second year.
Yeah, and I think that, look, we, with our new trees that are planted, like tube stop depths, like their root systems when they go in the ground, they're probably planted 10 centimetres to depth. Hopefully after a few months, they've got roots down in that 10 to 20 centimetre zone. I don't even know if we'd hit 30 centimetres deep by the time we hit summer. It probably depends on exactly when they were planted over winter, but they're probably sitting with their roots, somewhere between 10 and 25 centimetres, I guess. So do we use this to sort of look to when we can, like we've got saturation at depth at the moment, down to sort of that 50 centimetre depth. So any water that's applied now will sort of fill that bucket up locally at that spot, won't it? Will that act to sort of keep that bucket topped up? So I'm just trying to think of whether it helps us to look at, topping up early in the season before we start to get that depletion, at depth, because otherwise if we're watering at the top and we've got nothing down below, it's going to disappear quite quick from the profile, I'd imagine.
Yes. And the last 2 springs and early summers have been pretty kind, but when I went back to that data set in 2018, 2019, there were certainly triggers that would indicate that season's coming to an end.
Yeah.
One for pasture production and your grazing management, but also, water availability to trees. And probably just on that, I think you'd probably be pretty amazed at the extension of a root system on a tree as well. It certainly is an eye opener for your annual grass species, just how dynamic those root systems can be. Just getting away in autumn, they're quite aggressive, and obviously they're built that way for survival mechanisms, and accessing moisture that obviously in that reliable rainfall zone where moisture does get down to 80 centimeters and beyond. It's something that can be tapped into.
Yeah, right. So that was one of my other questions for you was, comparing the difference between, the Greta sites. We've got an annual pasture site and a perennial pasture site. So just understanding the difference of how much influence those, pasture species have on soil moisture, and whether you do see a big difference in use between them at depth, or whether there's pretty similar, or is the pattern of use different, at different times, or?
The pattern of use is quite similar come springtime, because the annuals have had the capacity to grow a root system and have it down at depth, whereas probably initially at the start of the season, and that's what Jason was looking to compare, your perennials, which have already got an established root and just needs the activation of the season to trigger regrowth because the roots are already there. Whereas with the annuals, they've got to strike, germinate, emerge, and develop. So the theory being that responses from the break could be better with the Flaris.
Yep. Thank you. Is this a good opportune time, Dale, to open it up more broadly if anyone else has any questions that they'd like to raise? I know we did have a comment in the chat function earlier from Stuart that in cropping, and I think this applies to where Stu used to live up around Griffith, he said we used to use WUE to benchmark produce, and that was in terms of grams of grain produced per millimetre of rain. So there was some standard sort of measurements that we use that he's referring to there.
Yes, some water use efficiency calculations. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if that's more of a comment than a question for you, but is it a similar sort of benchmarking that happens in Vic?
Definitely. Yep. So you've got growing season rainfall, which is recorded and incorporated for that benchmark of final yield production, and the incorporation of stored soil moisture also comes into that calculation. And probably in the past, without moisture probes, that's been a guess. You might have had rainfall out of season, but how much was actually stored and kept and to be utilised in that springtime by the crop was an unknown. Whereas now where it's becoming a known because of the monitoring devices in the ground. And then when I'm looking back at these extreme rain events that occasionally pop up in summertime, can't be utilised by the winter crop that season, but if the infiltration is great enough and goes down deep enough, it will be accessed by the winter crops come that springtime. And they've also got the thinking that the contribution of that deep soil moisture has a greater impact to grain production, because generally it's being utilised at that critical stage of growth, progressing from flowering into grain fill, and any moisture stress that is impacted on those winter crops at that point in time will start to decrease yields. But if we're able to tap in stored soil moisture, and if it's complemented by rainfall, as probably what we've observed this season, yield expectations can be raised.
Yeah, that's great. I've also got a question from Penny. Penny, would you like to turn your video on and ask your question to Dale directly? She's just...
So I was just trying to go on from what Stuart asked. Like, so he's saying there was a grain benchmark. Is there a grazing benchmark yet?
So at this stage, they're doing pasture cuts and trying to still determine production from paddocks. So certainly a lot more complex with pasture, grazing opportunities through the year. So how much has that paddock actually produced? Benchmarking with grain production is pretty simple. It's come harvest time. You know, how many tons was harvested from that paddock? So what we are determining is, you know, those early indicators of soil moisture. If it's looking like a challenging season, starting to make some management decisions, assessing stock numbers. If the season's going to be shorter than ideal, what are the triggers you can and levers you can pull? Do you need to start to look at acquiring fodder if you're going to maintain your stock numbers, or start to do some feed budgets? So that's sort of the thinking around it. With a better season, as we've been observing this year, what are the levers you could have pulled? Well, probably there's probably excess growth. So, you know, difficult to acquire stock at the price they are, but that would have been one of them. Pretty challenging to make fodder this year, but that would have been the other one, was to start allocating paddocks, taking them out of the rotation, and better utilising excess feed into fodder. And another comment was from one of the extension officers, was to target some grazing paddocks of the ones you'd know that would go off the earliest because there was excess pasture, and then later on graze the ones that would maintain their quality better. So that was another decision that might have been able to be swung into action with this season.
Yeah, that's great.
Probably presented also opportunities if you wanted to do some pasture improvements as well. There was potentially the improvement of taking out a paddock, sacrificing its production because there was already excess and ample production being generated from other paddocks, and that provided an opportunity to sow down an improved pasture species for long-term pasture improvements. So that certainly presented an opportunity as well, with the forecast outlook that was popping up on the dashboard from that model outlook, the assessment of the 12 models.
Yeah, it's very thorough. It's great to have all that information in one place. Stuart has just asked another question, Dale. How is growing rain calculated, and what is the evaporation number that you use to actually work that out?
Well, I'm probably counting rainfall as all effective.
Yep.
Which is an interesting concept, because we do, with the use of the moisture probes, we can actually monitor and track the influence of moisture changes with rainfall. And we probably know that rainfall falling on a very dry profile doesn't have a great influence. The infiltration can be quite low. Whereas when we can compare, and I think I did bring it up on an example, that progression into autumn, into winter, when you've got moisture that's down to 30 centimetres and you get a follow-up rain event, or even a sequence of another rain event after that, that's when you really start to see some big impacts and some greater infiltration, because the pore spaces are already full. We can see that with the data, and then any rainfall that falls just moves through those full pore spaces down into deeper depths.
Thanks, Dale. It's also something we didn't touch on before we started the workshop, was that there are actually 3 probes that you talked about in your presentation here for Greta, but only 2 are live on the site at the moment. So there was just it's the Phalaris paddock, isn't it? It's the perennial pasture one that there's a sensor issue at the moment. So
yeah. So we've found these sensors, the capacitance probes, very robust. They've been working for 10 years in those cropping scenarios, which is great. They've got a life expectancy of up to 20 years, so we'll test that. Where we come into problems with that Phalaris paddock, and the data's just being off for 3 or 4 months, is that we were looking to extend that monitoring point further into the paddock. So we actually had to do a connection, a join within the cable. And what we think is there's got a bit of corrosion into that join, and that's just shorted out the circuit. So we've been unable to obtain that data from that Phalaris paddock. But
that'll pop up at some point again soon.
Yes, yeah, we're hoping to. Yeah, yep. So this is what we've collected with that Phalaris paddock up until the date there. So what's that? Early September is when we lost the data.
Yep.
And probably attributed that it's a very wet profile at that stage, well past our field capacity, and probably presented that corrosion into that joint. So that was unfortunate, because that was a great data collection. And when I look at it, it followed pretty much the same trends as the other two sites. 2018, a challenging year. It did get wet in 2019, but Jason said, well, he's seen it wetter. And obviously that's been the case in 21 and 22. And that opportunity, when I did get out in the paddocks in this season, obviously I saw low-lying areas holding water, probably potentially old water courses carrying water. So that was a full profile, and no doubt catchment dams filled up associated with runoff because the profiles were fully charged. So we can probably get an indication for these probes as well when catchment dams are going to fill, or where the profile is still not full enough to allow that runoff because the soils weren't saturated.
Yeah, that's great. Probably, unless I've got probably one final question and then we'll wrap up. If people are interested in having this level of detail for their own property, whether it is because we have a few farmers in our patch that are production focused on nuts, and we've got vineyards and all that sort of stuff. What's a likely sort of cost for a setup for this sort of equipment? Like you mentioned before, that the probe itself is around $1,000 for sensors, for the 8, down to depth of 80 centimeters. But in terms of the logger and the solar panel and, at least 1 or 2 probes, what's the sort of total cost?
Yeah.
Something that's affordable for farms now. Are we seeing a shift in technology where it's becoming more accessible for people to have this information individually?
Yeah, we are seeing a shift in technology, and the units are becoming quite compact. They're becoming more efficient with their power requirements. So potentially you don't need those large solar panels to charge the modem. So moisture probe at approximately $1,000 for an 8 sensor capacitance probe. Those loggers and telemetry devices probably got a range from $1,200 up until $2,200 approximately. A rain gauge to add to that is about $300. That's just a simple tipping mechanism within that. And then the full weather station, if you're looking to collect temperature, humidity, and the wind speed and direction, you're probably looking at another $1,000 for that. So all up, it could be $4,000 for your sort of base model installation, and scale that up probably a couple of extra $1,000 if you're going to get more metal in your weather station instrumentation.
Yep.
And associated with that, you've also got a mobile SIM card in it, and that's how you're transferring the data from the field to a server and then accessing that via the internet.
So you got a monthly cost associated.
Yeah, it's very small packets of data that are sent on the hour and collectively on a 24-hour time frame. Data charges are probably going to be $5 to $10 a month, and then accessing the data on the internet is going to be $12 to $14.
Yep.
And that's what we're certainly seeing in the medium to low rainfall zones and cropping zones. That's a sort of dollar figure that those farmers are looking to implement. And it's probably making sense for them economically wise. We've got rising fertilizer costs, out of season rainfall, technology that's proven themselves. So if they're looking to apply inputs over a medium to large farm of $100,000 to $200,000, an investment of $5,000 for one reference point can certainly provide some great insights into at least one monitoring point on their farm.
Yeah, makes economic sense.
Yeah, and these pilots that we're running with AgVic, we're demonstrating the use of it. It's on that particular soil type at Greta. There could be some soil changes, could be lighter, could be heavier. We haven't got that sort of visual on that soil type, and that's where farmers might look to invest. Probably in the meantime, there's the capacity via the dashboard to subscribe and get more information, sort of highlighted here. So you can subscribe to get a pasture newsletter, and I certainly do interpretation of the data on a monthly basis for the cropping sites as well. And that newsletter is looking to be both educational, how to interpret data, and also informative in terms of the statewide seasonal condition reporting.
Yeah, and I do like to share that when I receive it from you. It usually goes out in our group newsletter, and Dale Gray's Fast Break videos and newsletters we also share with our members as well to make the best use of that forecasting information that's available. So if we don't, do we have any other further questions? Otherwise we might wrap up for today and try and keep it to an hour long. Nothing else? That's great. Well, thank you so much for hopping on board today, Dale, and taking us through the dashboard. I think it's a really fantastic tool. It's displayed really well for us to make good use of there's a great deal of data that's been collected there, and I think it's been displayed in a really simple way so that we can interpret what's going on. So congratulations on the new dashboard. I think it's a huge improvement, and if anyone has further questions, they can get in touch with me or I can connect them with you. And thanks for giving up your time today, and we look forward to making the best use of this data in the years to come. Thanks very much, Dale.
You're welcome, Sally, and happy to take questions at a later date and any inquiries about devices and interpretation of data. Very happy to do that.
Thanks very much. I'll just stop the recording now.